Okay, so we talked a little bit about the Chicano movement in California, where we were talking about the farm workers and how they were organizing. We looked at New Mexico with Reyes Tijerina, who was organizing there. And then we looked at Denver with Corky Gonzalez and the Crusade for Justice, right? So this is all happening during the 1960s as part of a larger Chicano movement that was fighting for their rights. Another aspect of the Chicano movement was the student movement. We'll take a look at the role that students played in this movement. All right. So, what were the motivations for the Chicano youth to get involved in this fight for civil rights? Well, there were a number of things. Right. There were some issues that directly affected students, such as racism inside the schools. We talked about this before, where Mexicans and Mexican Americans were discriminated against in their schools. They were often segregated so that they were not allowed to go to school with Anglo Americans. They received a lesser education, and they were directed into vocational programs instead of being pushed to go to universities, right? There was not a lot of Mexican and Mexican American students who went to universities during this time. Another issue was because of the Vietnam War, a lot of federal funding was taken away from the school system at this time. And so you have students who were fighting back against that. They wanted more funding for their schools so that they can get a better education. We also talked about how more and more youth were getting involved directly in the Chicano movement. We talked about the youth conference in Denver. There were a number of youth from all over the nation who were involved in that. The youth were also taking part in other movements. There were youth who participated in the march with Cesar Chavez to Sacramento. And so they were getting experience in this political movement. And so that's why you see more and more students getting involved. Another thing that was attractive to them was the separatist ideology that was being promoted within the Chicano movement at this time, right? That's attractive to young people, this idea of breaking away from a society that doesn't accept them. Right? They're feeling the discrimination, they're feeling the racism in their society. And so, why not break away from the United States and just focus on your own identity, right? And your own community and building institutions for yourself, right? And so, that's a part of this idea of self determination and separatism, separating from the U.S. because the U.S. wasn't providing for the Mexican and Mexican American communities. And so, you would see students coming together, forming organizations, and having a number of demands. Some of their demands included the creation of a Mexican American Studies program within their schools. Another one of their demands was that the schools needed to hire more Mexican teachers and Mexican administrators. They also wanted a greater role in the decision making process in the school system. And so you would see a number of Mexican American students taking part in activism during this time. In the late 60s, there were student walkouts, massive student walkouts, where thousands of Mexican students walked out of their schools in East Los Angeles and in other places in LA. In Texas, you would have students going out on strike until their demands were met by the local school board, and they were successful, particularly in Crystal City, Texas, where they were able to obtain some of their demands. And so you see this massive student movement taking place as part of the larger Chicano movement. During this time, you would see the formation of Mecha, the largest student union, in 1969 during a meeting at the University of Santa Barbara. So at this meeting, there was a plan that was created called the Plan de Santa Barbara, and this plan called for the organization of all the various Mexican American student organizations into one greater student organization, and that was Mecha, right? Because at this time there were a number of different student organizations all over the country, and so they decided to come together to form one larger organization so that they would have more power. There's more strength in numbers, okay? And so that was the formation of Mecha. During this protest era, you'd also see the organization of a women's movement, the Chicano women's movement. The women's movement would come out of the larger Chicano movement during this time, and the reason for this was because a lot of women's issues weren't being brought into the spotlight as part of the larger Chicano movement, right? And so you would have male members of the union who thought that it wasn't really important to bring the women's issues to the forefront, right? We're talking about issues like abortion, reproductive reproductive rights, access to birth control. These are issues that were important to Chicanas, but it wasn't being brought forth in the larger Chicano movement. Instead, the Chicano movement was more focused on racism and discrimination, right? And so the women felt that their issues were not being heard. And so this led to a number of Chicano organizations being formed where women's issues could be brought to the forefront. At first, the Chicano organizations were in alignment with the Anglo-American feminist movement. Eventually, Chicana feminists would break away from the Anglo-American feminist movement, and one of the main reasons is because the Anglo-feminist movement was more focused on the issues of gender inequality, right? Only gender inequality, how men were suppressing women. Right, that was their main focus. They were not really focused on issues of poverty, classism, and racism. And these were issues that affected Mexican and Mexican American women, right? And so those issues were not being heard within the larger feminist movement. And so the Chicanas felt that they had to break away from the Anglo-American feminist movement and start their own movement that really paid attention not just to gender inequality, but issues that affected Mexican and Mexican Americans in general. In 1971, the National Chicana Conference held in Texas would address some of these issues, right? They would focus on women's rights, but also on racism. Some of the women who were attending this conference would walk out on it, though, because they felt that women's issues weren't being highlighted enough. They felt that the conference was focused too much on racism and not enough on women's rights and women's issues, right? And so there was a little split there at the conference, but ultimately, you would see more and more Chicano organizations forming as part of the larger Chicano movement.